So I wanted to start with the remit of the working group, and some of you may have heard me mention this again as you guys were joining this evening. So the remit comes obviously directly from the motion that was passed at the federal conference back in September last year, and it's basically it tries to do three things following that motion. The first is that we need to be able to fund a UBI in a socially just and equitable manner to create a fairer social security system for all. So I don't think there's anything we necessarily disagree with as members of the party. But the next two things I think are really important. I'm going to take them slightly in reverse order. The third point, which I probably should have put second, is around ensuring that vulnerable people do not lose out compared to the current benefit system. And that's really important to bear in mind when we're going through this, because the proposal in the consultation paper looks very much at keeping, initially putting a universal basic income alongside universal credit. And I'll go into more reasons why, but essentially it's trying to keep in mind that no one should be any worse off than now. And in fact, actually they should be better off than now. Otherwise there's little point in doing this. And that other point, which again is very important to bear in mind when we come to look at maybe the price tag for this policy, which some of us have already been talking about on the chat this evening, is around considering the impact of effectively of spending a sizable sum of money on UBI, what that does to the ability of the party to fund other policy priorities when we come to a manifesto, whether that election is next year or the year after or the year after that. So just try and keep those three things in mind, and I'll keep coming back to them. So I thought it was important to go back, and again, I mentioned I chaired the Fairer Share for All working group back in 2018 that came to conference in September 2018. And that came up with some really important changes to universal credit. And that, again, is what gave us the confidence in the consultation paper to advocate keeping hold of universal credit, at least in the first parliament of a Liberal Democrat or sort of Liberal Democrat influenced government. And just to go through those very quickly, that we would pay universal credit in 5 days and not 5 weeks, because obviously that cash flow issue and that waiting time is a really, really big issue for many people in the benefit system. We would abolish the current sanctions system, whereby if you under what's called conditionality, some of you may be familiar with, you have to fulfill certain things around potentially, particularly looking for a job or getting new skills. Otherwise, you have your benefits removed in part, or depending on the number of times you fall foul of the regime, you may lose all your benefits completely. We would also remove the 2-child limit around child benefit and remove the benefits cap as well. That's the amount that a household or an individual can claim in total, including any benefits they're claiming for their housing costs. And obviously, again, even recently in the spring federal conference, we were making changes to try and improve the social security system for disabled people and carers. So again, keep that in mind when we maybe come on to talk about retaining universal credit at all, or indeed maybe as an alternative, improving universal credit. So what wouldn't be included in a UBI? So as again, many of you will be aware, the benefit system is incredibly complex. Certainly Asquith and Lloyd George, let alone Beveridge, would have been absolutely astonished by the complexity of the system that has grown up in the last sort of 110, 120 years. What we're very conscious of, though, is that in order not to make people any worse off, and in order to also make sure we do not waste money, is that the 4 things you can see on the screen wouldn't be included. So one is disability benefits, and that's because disabled people obviously have a range of abilities and barriers and caring needs. And what we didn't want to say is, let's all put that into a universal amount, because it's just completely difficult to try and work out how much an individual needs. So So that was a very similar approach to the one we also took with housing costs, because obviously the cost of renting somewhere in the private rented sector in Lewes will be very different from London, and will be different again from Liverpool. So again, we just can't see a way in which you don't either end up absolutely overfunding an individual or shortchanging them on the flip side of that coin. We also haven't looked in this first phase proposal for universal basic income at either including under 18s or people of retirement age in the system. And again, it's one of the questions we asked in the consultation, is whether or not there should actually be, to replace child benefit, a UBI at a lower level for under 18s. And that's something we're keen to hear people's views on. And similarly with people who are drawing a pension, obviously that age slightly varies in terms of what year people were born and the different laws that have changed. But it's something we felt was already a universal payment. Obviously there have been glitches in the system that people like Steve Webb during the coalition years were trying to fix, in terms of particularly pensions for many older women who, through not working, didn't pay the full sort of national insurance contribution over their lifetime, and obviously many of those cases still rumble on. But we think that's something we could look at, pensions, in terms of including that in a universal basic income in a sort of second iteration. But there would be potentially a cost to doing that, particularly as universal basic income applies to individuals rather than to a household. And for people will know that obviously as a pensioner couple, you effectively get sort of 1.5 times a pension rather than getting 2 full pensions, because the state assumes there's a sort of economy of scale, if you like, of being in a pensioner couple. So again, it's something that we would have to increase the funding to achieve those sort of 2 purely individual pensions if they were brought under a universal basic income. So that brings us on to kind of what would be in it, and what price or what sort of level of universal basic income we should look at providing. We've looked at 4 different points: £45, £60, £75 or £95 a week, very much with an aspiration for raising it thereafter. That would effectively allow many more people to move off means tested benefits, off universal credit in most people's cases. Crucially for this, and I have to say that maths is not my strongest suit, and I've been very lucky to have had 2 or 3 members of the working group who are absolutely fantastic at the sort of financial modelling of all this. But what's crucial to that model and to the consultation paper is that the basic income wouldn't be taxable, but it would be classified as income when it runs alongside universal credit. So so effectively, what does that mean on the ground? What does that mean for people's pockets? It means that someone currently receiving the £94 universal credit a week would get that £60 universal basic income. Crucially, they wouldn't have to, whilst they would have to apply for the universal credit, there wouldn't be any strings attached to it any longer. And that's something that was passed through a Fairer Share for All 3 years ago, and we ran on at the last general election. They get those 2 amounts, but effectively you would deduct £37 of their universal credit, because universal basic income would be seen as income. So that would leave people with about £116.20 a week. So getting up towards that £120 a week that was trialled as a basic income within that sort of 2,000 or 3,000 cohort in Finland that we were talking about earlier. So we think that effectively this works in terms of supporting and increasing the incomes of people at the lower end of the income spectrum. Certainly something I was very proud on was when the Institute for Fiscal Studies looked at our last manifesto. It really did do more than any other party's manifesto to support people on low incomes, those sort of bottom 20% of the income spectrum, if you like. So this is something we are confident would again support that group of people, and it would mean that people at the upper end, in the sort of top 20-30% of incomes, would be paying a bit more in tax in order to fund that. So that's about the balance of it. In terms of what happens to that middle group, which I guess arguably we would often kind of see as maybe our natural LibDem voters, the impact on them really depends on where you settle on the 45, 60, 75 or 95 pounds a week level, because obviously in order to fund each of those, it costs a little bit more in taxation to pay for it. So you then drag more people into perhaps being people paying in to support the lower paid, rather than they themselves potentially gaining. But so we didn't want to put that in the consultation paper just because we wanted to get more of a steer from the party in terms of where it felt we needed to be looking at in terms of income. But certainly in the final paper, we'll look to make sure that conference, before it votes on anything in September, knows exactly the sort of distributional impact of the sort of price point we end up putting forward in the final paper. So talking about funding, I should start by saying that universal basic income is not cheap, and some of you may be aware of that already. So we've primarily looked for the consultation paper at changes to the personal income tax allowance and to the national insurance primary threshold, in order to fund as much as we can of the policy. It's kind of in line with a couple of the sort of leading experts who've been sort of churning out fantastic academic work on this for about 20 years now, particularly a guy called Malcolm Torrey, who has worked with the party before on some of these issues. And it sort of follows his method of doing this, which was also taken up by another academic, Howard Reed, who put together the document for Compass, who are on the sort of the right of the Labour Party. So they're again another sort of group who are looking at this issue. And they've basically, we think that by looking at changes to the personal allowance, so again, for those members of longer standing, we obviously campaigned in the run-up to the coalition and during the coalition to implement a more generous personal allowance, now up to £12,500 a year for income tax. We are suggesting that come down to £2,500, and that national insurance primary threshold also comes down considerably as well to, albeit at least £50 a week. And in a way, that's because we want to make sure that we don't drag in people already on low incomes into ending up paying more tax inadvertently. So we're trying to avoid that, which is a little bit of a difficult balance, but we think it sort of chimes in with the best academic work that's been done on this. So we feel it's robust, even if members may end up disagreeing with it as a method of paying for it. Having said that, though, it still leaves us with a funding gap, and as you can imagine, that funding gap changes depending on how high you set a universal basic income. So as I move on to the next slide, what I've tried to show is effectively, even taking into account the national income, the national insurance changes and the personal allowance for income tax changes, it still leaves us with a shortfall in terms of funding this, and this is the shortfall in billions per year. And as you can see, it goes up through the levels. To take the £60 a week, which in quite a few of the consultation sessions has appeared to be about the level where we feel it's generous enough if we're going to push forward with UBI, but also is fundable at the moment, and we can argue for it. It leaves us with, on a good day, £22 billion to find, 28 billions on a bad day. Let's call it 25, and then I only have to say one figure. Now, what we need to think about is that in some context. When we funded a very generous childcare policy at the last general election manifesto, which I think was popular both with members and with electors, that was just under about £5 billion, and that was the most expensive thing effectively in the manifesto. So you can see by a sort of magnitude of 4 or 5 times, this is a very, very big ticket item, and probably would have to be the centerpiece of any manifesto going forward, which is why at the beginning I thought it was important to remind people of the remit we'd had from the Federal Policy Committee, which is to say, in thinking about this, don't forget we also have to fund the increases we maybe want to see in social care or in early years education. So again, just trying to give members the best possible context we can as we go through the exercise. This is something which a member of the working group put together, and he's actually also working on a carbon tax proposal that the party is looking at, which I think is coming to the conference again in September. And it's just kind of looking at ways of trying to close that £25 billion gap. Obviously, corporation tax is very topical today in terms of some developed countries thinking about harmonising a level maybe into the mid 20%, which obviously for the UK, in terms of, we've seen over the last 10 years the number go down to 19% for corporation tax. If it were to go up to 24, 25%, that would bring in 15 to potentially 18 billion pounds of revenue a year. So there are some other ways to pay for this which don't involve income tax. As you can see, the fourth line down suggests that if you put 1% on all three of the different rates of income tax, you're only bringing in, I say only, £8 billion. So you might countenance, we might argue for an extra 1% going on income tax, but obviously we probably want to strike a balance in how we potentially funded the policy. And that's, again, something which, when I talk to the Federal Policy Committee next week, but also then obviously we come forward with a recommendation to conference, more importantly in September, we'll need to make sure that in that paper we're absolutely clear and can give members a real feel for if you want this, then it costs this, and if you're happy with that, then we can move forward. We've also, within the group and within the consultation paper, very keen that this should be in line with the motion that was passed at conference last September, which is to say that it should be a phased system, because we have to make sure that it works, that our assumptions are right, and that we make corrections to it if for whatever reason it's not quite working out as we want to see. We think there is scope, and we've had a few discussions on the working group, which is to say, if you can persuade the public of the case for universal basic income, that's a really big step, because it's such a cultural, and I sort of mean that in a very broad sense, change for the UK to adopt something like this potentially, because it's the sort of no strings attached universality of it is just something that's very different, and perhaps would have more in common with some of the social democratic traditions of other countries in sort of Northwest Europe and Scandinavia. But we think once it could be implemented, then we could expand that level from, say, an initial £60 up into the sort of £150 or even £200 a week, which obviously would then remove the need for universal credit. You've obviously got to get above the level now in order to phase everything out. Otherwise, we risk leaving people worse off than if we'd never gone down this path in the first place. So that's kind of the aspiration, is to go a bit further. And again, in the consultation paper, we do ask the question, and I come with my notepad to take notes this evening. Are people feeling on whether or not we are going too far too fast, or indeed we should be going further faster? So I just sort of leave that maybe for you guys to feedback on later. And then, yes, I mean, this is somewhat superfluous as we are towards the end, and in fact this is such an old slide that we're indeed consulting well past the 30th of May. It was about 10 days late going on the website. So, but we are consulting until the end of this Monday, so there's time if we want to fill in anything on detail. But as I say, I've brought my pen and notepad to the table this evening, so I'll be taking notes, and basically would love to hear as much feedback as you have time to give, and have a really good discussion. And as I say, the final proposal is going to go to federal conference in September, but obviously will be published well beforehand. I think Federal Conference Committee have brought forward the deadline for all of these papers to get to them, so they can be published in much better time for the conference. So I think we might well be able to see them even before the end of July this year. So plenty of time for amendments, and for people to think about writing speeches either for or against the policy when we come to it in September. But I'll stop sharing the slides there, and very happy to answer any or all questions. So yes, back to you, Chair.